And so it's into that gaping maw that Alex has launched kind of a first read of history, and I say that with zero pejorative connotation, uncharacteristically, but to sort of get through what the Biden administration thought about foreign policy. And of course, Joe Biden's been in politics for an awfully long time. So the book gets into some of the evolution of Joe Biden's thoughts about foreign policy, but in particular, their interpretation in the years between 2016 and 2020 about where they thought the country needed to go. And then, of course, their implementation of foreign policy in the first 2.5-ish years in office. So with that, I'll introduce Alex to set up the book and introduce Emma Ashford and Chris Miller, who will be the discussants today. We will have what I hope is a rollicking discussion, hotly contested, about the contents of the book. And I should mention, above all, that books are available outside the auditorium for sale, in addition to fine online retailers for those watching online. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, Alex. He has promised to reveal the source of his most prominent article if we sell all of the books that are outside. So please make sure to buy 3, 4, 6, however many copies are left, so that we can get all the dirt about Alex's most famous or infamous stories, depending on where you sit. I'm being sarcastic here, of course. Alex Ward is a national security reporter at Politico and authors the must-read newsletter National Security Daily, which I have to admit, again, I'm not a real sycophant here, covers a lot of ground. It's not uncommon. I mean, I live and breathe this stuff, and it's not uncommon that there's something in Alex's newsletter where I say, wait, what's happening in Haiti? And, get into the weeds there. So it's a very useful thing for those of us who do this stuff. He's won numerous awards for his reporting, including notably being part of a Politico team that was named a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. Before his work at Politico, he was Vox's White House and national security reporter and also an associate director of the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. So it's Alex's book we're here to talk about, and the discussants today, we didn't discuss batting order. Emma, are you okay to go first? Okay, and then Chris Miller will go second. Emma Ashford is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point and an adjunct in the Security Studies program at Georgetown. Her first book, I should italicize her first book, Oil, the State, and War, The Foreign Policies of Petrostates, was published by Georgetown University Press in 2022. Prior to her work at Stimson, she was a fellow at the Atlantic Council and here at the Cato Institute back in the dark old days, if I can't remember when. She's a term member of CFR and holds a PhD in foreign affairs from UVA. And the second discussant today is Christopher Miller, a commentator of some note who was here at Cato, 8-10 months ago, something like that, talking about his own book. So I'm the only unbooked person on the dais up here today. He served as the acting Secretary of Defense at the end of the Trump administration. Previous to that, he performed the duties of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, if I can unwind the acronym there, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Combating Terrorism, as well as the National Security Council's Special Assistant to the President and Director for Countering Terrorism and Transnational Threats. He was commissioned as an infantry officer in 1987 through ROTC, Army Reserve, and served in the D.C. National Guard as an MP. He likes to laugh about that a little bit for reasons you may uncover here. In 1993, he transferred to Special Forces in the 5th Special Forces Group Airborne, commanded the 2nd Battalion there, and served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He holds a bachelor's degree from George Washington here in town and a master's from the Naval War College. So with that, I told Alex to do 30 or 40 minutes at the outset. He thought that was too long, so he's going to go a little shorter than that, mercifully, and then we'll hear some comments from Emma and from Chris Miller. So, Alex, tell us what the heck is going on with the Biden administration's foreign policy.
Yeah, I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Well, thanks so much for having me, Justin, Cato, Emma, Chris, for being here. You guys for coming in person. Who knew that it was still a thing after COVID? And to all of you online watching. And I also recommend very much this Cato Institute branded water. Tastes like freedom. Anyway.
Don't ask about the ingredient list.
So, I wrote this book, and look, the initial concept of it really was kind of to look at the transition from Trump to Biden, because I do feel sort of in a grand 30,000-foot sense, we are moving into a new era of general American foreign policy. There was, while, the sine curve moves up and down, from the end of World War II, 1945, to kind of roughly the end of the Obama administration, foreign policy was kind of constant, Republican, Democrat. Again, some changes, but sort of the main through lines. And we're seeing some pretty significant shifts. I'm not saying a wholesale change, but some significant shifts, one of which, of course, would be shift away from free trade, a shift away from public sentiment about being engaged in long foreign wars. So, again, these are somewhat not marginal, but they are not a wholesale shift, but they are a shift. And so I wanted to get a sense of what would be changes from Trump to Biden, what would be kept, what would not be kept. Then Afghanistan happens. Then Ukraine happens. And then I get a lovely call from my publisher, and hey, you should probably stay on this story. Things are going to get a little weird and wacky. And I agreed. We should probably figure out what is going to happen and what this means. So it ended up going from kind of a sort of survey of where we were as a state of a country in terms of our foreign policy, and more, if I may, a sort of like inside the room Woodwardian style reported book about what the heck was going on. So let's start from the beginning. Jake Sullivan is right next to Hillary Clinton as she's conceding to Trump. And if you know anything about Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, he cares very deeply about his middle-class roots from Minnesota. And despite going to Yale and being a Rhodes Scholar and all that, but he cares very deeply about having, 5 siblings. They ate pasta at night, right? They would circle the globe and talk about countries that parents were educators. And there he is next to Hillary Clinton and being effectively out-populisted, out-middle-classed by Donald Trump, who's not that thing. And Jake kind of goes through an introspection. And he goes, okay, so what did I miss? What is it about foreign? Because in his mind, Trump didn't necessarily win because of his foreign policy views, but he didn't lose because of them either, right? That he was saying some unorthodox things, and not necessarily wrong things, just unorthodox things. And unorthodox for the people in this room and in this town. So what was it that he was saying that was resonating and didn't cause him to necessarily lose enough votes to lose the election? And I won't spare you his 4 years in the I'll spare you the 4 years in the wilderness, but what it effectively came down to was a phrase you've heard before, a foreign policy for the middle class. And at its base, the base assumption is that American foreign policy will not work, will not be sustainable, unless the public is for a certain action. It seems simple, but that is kind of where they concluded. So what does this mean? That means, and let me give you some sort of example. So when I talk about Ukraine in this exact moment, right? Why the U.S. should continue to defend Ukraine. Well, they initially started with democracy. We defend democracy. That's very important. And it's still a big part of it. I don't want to sway you away from it. But the other part of it, what they're now starting to say is, well, this creates jobs, right? We're sending our older weapons to the Ukrainians. That means we're going to make newer weapons, which is helpful for our military. And what does that mean? Factory jobs for people in Ohio, Texas, Alabama, Kansas. That is a middle-class benefit. And then they also do bring it to a broader example, a broader sentiment, where they say, well, if you don't stop the Russians in Ukraine, that means they're going to maybe eventually take NATO territory or attack a NATO territory, which will require an Article 5 response, which then means we're sending American sons and daughters abroad to fight, which ends up being more expensive and, of course, costly in blood and treasure. So there are middle-class arguments. So that's, take it for what it's worth, but that's sort of the main argument there. And what I found in reporting in this book is that while they're making these foreign policy for the middle class arguments, they end up adopting a lot more of Trump-era policies than I think even they expected to. So when I was talking to them during the transition, they were really talking, Derek Chollet said this on the record, right? The counselor of the State Department doesn't look like he's going to the Pentagon, but that he was saying, look, we're coming in to save the world. They really felt that the Trump administration, sorry, Chris, the Trump administration had totally abandoned a sense of its place in the world, had hurt our alliances, had damaged America's reputation, and that Biden's team was coming in like first responders, emergency personnel, and they were going to revive the heartbeat of American foreign policy. And then what happens? Well, on one of the early calls that I was on with Biden administration officials, we were talking about China. And they said, well, the Trump administration got it right. They got that we needed to compete against China very strongly. The only thing they really got wrong was that they did it alone. They didn't really work with allies. setting aside the fact that towards the end of the Trump administration, especially, they were talking to allies in Europe, et cetera, about getting, kicking out the Huaweis and the ZTEs of the world, and pushing back on trade, but still, that's how they felt. So they thought, okay, they were right on that. We just got to get more allies involved, and then the response to China will be stronger. And also, maybe we should talk more about where there are places for us to cooperate, even as while we compete. And the Abraham Accords, ain't that a thing? That worked out pretty well. Why don't we stay talking to the Israelis, have them reach out to a bunch of countries in the Middle East still, try to normalize those relations. And oh, by the way, that whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict thing, put that to the side, but maybe we can bank shot it. If we get these normalization deals going, and especially with the Saudis, maybe eventually we can get the Palestinians on the path to a state. So 2 examples, but sort of surprising not only to me in the reporting, but in actually for them. They didn't expect, as they did a review, to adopt so many, not only just those 2, but other elements of a Trump foreign policy as they were going. Now to some of the main aspects that you'll read about in the book. So Afghanistan comes along. Biden makes the decision to withdraw. He does so. We knew that from the campaign. We knew that's what he wanted to do. They did do a 4-month review, and to their credit, from everyone I talked to, from the State Department, the Pentagon, and et cetera, they all said they felt heard. Biden heard the Pentagon's case to stay. They heard the State Department's case that allies didn't want the U.S. to make the decision to leave unilaterally, but Biden made the case to leave. He made the decision, so everyone executed. The original sin of this, right, and we're setting aside the fact that Trump made the deal with the Taliban, which Biden felt he needed to, or at least said he needed to follow. The original sin of this is when Biden is making the decision, there's an intelligence assessment that says it will take 18 to 24 months for the Taliban to take over Afghanistan. Now, what does that mean? That means that all of the things the administration was planning to do, which meant getting Americans out, Afghan allies of Americans out, figuring out what that means for the embassy there if the Taliban were to be in charge, all of that was not necessarily they weren't dilly-dallying, they were slow-walking it, just that they had more time. And so the Taliban, of course, starts sweeping across the country, that timeline starts to shrink, and then they have to improvise. And one could argue they improvised decently well, in the sense of they were able to, with commercial partners and other allies, get 120,000, 125,000 people out in the greatest airlift in American history. Of course, we must also, and this is where the nuance comes into play, must remember 13 service members were killed. There was horrendous humanitarian strife outside of the airport. There's a gentleman I chronicle in the book, a guy named Sam Aronson, who I recommend, if you get the book, for any reason, get it to hear Sam's story. He's making life or death decisions for full Afghan families, to the point that you'll have one person say, I have the papers, I can get in on the plane. And he says, yes, you do, but your family doesn't. So either you come, and you'll never see your family again, or you stay behind with your family and possibly die. So anytime the Biden administration says, yes, we made the right strategic decision to leave, we handled the airlift very well, we're a professional team, all those things can be true, but it's hard to make the case that this was an overly successful withdrawal when you have instances like that. They learned some lessons, though. The main one being you need allies to be involved with your decision. You need to work with them constantly, to be in touch with them constantly. And also, if there's a changing intelligence picture, we need to let the world know. So John Feiner, the Deputy National Security Advisor, is one of the first in the White House to get the intelligence that the Russians are coming, that they're really planning for something in Ukraine. And he walks over to Jake Sullivan's office and he goes, look what's happening here. We need to start making things happen. We need to respond quickly. And they basically they set up a tiger team, right, to figure out all the main components of the response, but the main ones are develop sanctions with allies, tell our allies what we know, tell the Ukrainians what we know, develop a military assistance response and a genuine diplomatic response, which was if the Russians have issues, if they're threatening the Ukrainians for certain diplomatic issues, let's talk to them. Let's hear them out. Let's see if it's real. Of course, they wanted to be caught trying, though, mostly. They didn't expect the Russians to actually make a deal, but it leads to a more legitimate cause to resist the Russians if we were willing to, we being the U.S., to negotiate in good faith, and the Russians weren't. And then, so, of course, the response ends up being, arguably, at the beginning, pretty strong, right? I mean, you can quibble with maybe we should have sent weapons earlier, the U.S. should have sanctioned the Russians, but the administration thought that wasn't the right response. And still, at the end, with Western support, the Ukrainians were very well defended. Of course, they defended themselves ably for a long time. The reason we're sort of in this conversation now about is it going well or not is because the counteroffensive didn't go really as planned, and we're having the congressional strife that we're having. And I mentioned the Israel-Hamas stuff sort of already, but that was sort of in part what led us here. Hamas didn't have to do what they did. They did what they did. And so now we're sort of, but a lot of critics would say the administration, because they let the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to fester in general, that it led to a situation like an October 7th, but not necessarily directly responsible. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means a couple of things. One is, even though the title is called the Internationalists, they are not fully internationalists, that they have adopted some elements of, the narrative is that Trump nationalism, let's say, although I would say a more restrained, probably, idea of America's engagement. And in that sense, we are now, as we head to the election, in this space where there is going to be, regardless of who wins, Trump or Biden, there is going to be some shift in American foreign policy history. With Biden, a few degrees. With Trump, a pretty big one. And so there, while many people are saying I'm now basically arguing that this will be an election between the internationalists and the nationalists, well, to a certain extent, yes. But to a certain extent, it just means the degrees to which American foreign policy is going to change. Because you will have still a focus on alliances and transatlanticism with Biden. You're probably not going to have that much with Trump. There will still be some focus on restrictive immigration with Biden. Definitely a lot more with Trump. You'll have, et cetera, et cetera. We can go through the list, and I want to make sure I leave enough for Emma and Chris to talk about. But that's kind of the main conclusions in the book, is that I think you will get a deeply reported inside look as how the administration was what they were thinking about when it came to Afghanistan, Ukraine, and some other important decisions. You'll notice how, even though they called climate change an existential crisis, they barely did anything about it. You'll see some of the divisions within the team. You'll also see what I think is, even though they've tried to be boring, what will end up being, just in the history of American foreign policy, a fairly consequential and arguably, and I know this is overused in the think tank world, but an inflection point, in terms of how the fact that Biden being the avatar of traditional American foreign policy, and while he's still very close to it, was in agreement with the Jake Sullivans and those of the world to start to move away to something a little different. I'll leave it there.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Emma, how much did you love Alex's book? How terrific was it on a scale of 1,000 to 10 million?
How much can you afford, Alex? No, I congrats on the book. It is it's really interesting, but it's a really good read, I think, is the other thing. Even as someone who spends a lot of time working on this stuff, who, lived through most of this in the last couple of years, there's a lot of really great details in there, things. The one that this morning I was looking back through it and thinking, the Russians, when they went into Ukraine, they were trying to stage false flag attacks, and they were evacuating civilians in the Donbass. I totally forgot they did that because things were so confused at that time. So this is, again, as Justin says, without being pejorative, this is a really great draft of history because I think it sort of lays out these crises and how the administration responded to them in real time. I guess I was just going to try and pull out a couple of themes that I took from the book that I think would be interesting to talk more about. Because, this is, and I'll come back to this in a second, but I think, again, this is a book about crisis. This is not necessarily a book about the Biden foreign policy writ large. And to some extent, that is because crisis has come to symbolize the Biden foreign policy so strongly. You can see a number of things coming out fairly clearly across the narrative, though. One is that this administration, you can say internationalist versus nationalist, but you could also say, basically process versus chaos, right? This administration is the anti-Trump administration in perhaps its devotion to doing it right in terms of process, in terms of interagency consultations, in terms of having lengthy conversations about whether this is something the US should be doing or not. And there are good points to that, definitely. There are also bad points to that. I think we see an administration, more broadly than just in the book, but you see it in these first 2 years, an administration that is very willing to go back and forward and equivocate on, should we get out of Afghanistan or not, but then don't do really quite enough to actually plan for the process. And something that comes out pretty strongly in the book is they debated, should we get out, for so long that they almost ran out of time to get out. Now, in credit to the administration, you can see in the contrast between the Afghanistan and the Ukraine discussion in the book that they really did seem to learn that some of that lesson, at least. By the time Ukraine comes around, they're much better prepared for contingencies in that process. But still, again, throughout the book, you see an administration that is very willing to ask big questions, but in many ways views themselves as constrained by precedents, even when they find those precedents to be problematic. And one thread to pull on here would be, I think, the Crimea discussion. It comes across pretty clearly from the discussion of the administration's own discussions in the book that the administration very much thinks that Crimea is a red line for Russia when it comes to Ukraine, that they would have liked the Ukrainians to not be striking Crimea or striking inside Russian territory, but they effectively felt themselves to be powerless to do or say anything different about that because of the precedent that had been set under Obama that Crimea is an integral part of Ukraine. And so, the picture that kind of emerges is an administration that's very good at process, fairly open-minded, at least on some things, but absolutely not willing to take big decisions if they depart from what they think of as the core of US foreign policy. And I think it's very interesting that throughout the book, most of the principles, they maintain this vision of the United States as the world's protector. Looks similar to previous democratic administrations. The main difference is just that we have somehow shifted from, the responsibility to protect and a Samantha Power focus on humanitarianism, we've shifted over to democracy. And not to sort of undermine what you were saying earlier, but I think something that's really notable here is, the middle class is nowhere in this book other than in those speeches by Jake Sullivan. And so this is a very different thing than they came into office promising to actually do. A few other themes that I thought were interesting in the book. So there's some really fun tidbits on US allies. I thought it was very interesting that the Biden administration really appears to have underestimated European states on their response to the invasion of Ukraine when it came to sanctions and things like Nord Stream 2. There was this perception the US would have to lead from way out front, and actually that turned out not to be true. And if, that has implications for how we think about Europeans and what they might be willing to do in the absence of the US. Vladimir Zelensky does not come out of this book looking particularly good. I would be interested to hear Alex talk just a little more about that, because we, I think, again, focus very much on his personality post-invasion of Ukraine. But the period prior to that, the year or so prior to that invasion, the picture that emerges is of a leader who is very much disconnected from reality and sort of asking the US for things they can't give. It's an interesting portrayal, and I don't know if you can say if that came from the US side or not, but I think that would be interesting to find out. A few other tidbits. So one is, again, the excessive sort of fixation in the administration on this idea that if Ukraine falls, it will be the first domino. And this is something you see a little in speeches from the Biden administration. You don't see it in strategy documents as much, but you hear it a lot from folks in the administration when they're talking about conflicts. And I think it's interesting to dwell on the fact that the Biden administration, everyone from Milley through the political appointees to Biden himself, appeared to believe that the stakes in Ukraine were not the sovereignty of Ukraine or the invasion of Ukraine. It was everything in the world more broadly, world order. And again, this is very different from what they came into office promising to do. It's very disconnected from the needs of everyday Americans or the middle class. It is a vision that is much more in line with prior Democratic administrations. Last point that I will make here is, this is, as I say, this is a great book on crisis, but if I have one criticism, I think it is that...
I'm glad it's only one.
Well, one big one. We can talk later. It's that I think the book ignores the top of the duck, and I will explain what I mean by that. So people often talk about a well-executed policy in government as, it's like a duck. It's gliding serenely on top of the water. Underneath, the feet are paddling wildly. And I think this is a book about paddling wildly and about the crises that we see. And it doesn't really get into that serenely gliding part of the administration that's been moving forward on, a lot of these big issues things like economic statecraft, export controls, continuing a lot of those Trump policies, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on Indo-Pacific. And so, the book feels in some ways a little like an iceberg, to shift metaphors in midstream. We see the crises at the top. That is not the whole of the Biden administration. And, that's obviously not what you were trying to do in this book. But this is one part of what the administration has had to deal with. So I will wrap up there and pass it over to Chris.
Thanks for writing this book. This is really, really powerful. And I know you had to work full time and still write. When I joined the Army in 1983, I was a avowed internationalist, and then got mugged by history in 2001. And a book jumped out at me then, which was James Mann's The Rise of the Vulcans. This is our current era's response to that. And it's super important what you've done here to lay out for the people that are still trying to figure this out, to understand what's going on. So man, you nailed it. It's just a killer book. I got to tell you, I got so angry reading your book. I mean, so angry. And I know veterans only account for 1% or that served in Afghanistan, Iraq, only 1%. We're not a political force. I understand that. Nobody really cares what we have to say. But your chapter about Afghanistan, and you highlighted Sam Aronson, that alone is worth the price of this book. It is the most powerful description, and here's what really gives me hope. We sit in our ivory towers here in D.C., and, or at West Exec, where all these people came out of, and, those of you, I haven't been there, of course, obviously they don't invite me, but I'm sure they've got like those conference rooms with the glass that when you want to like be private, you can push that button and like it fogs over. And I imagine you look out over like Washington, D.C., and, deals are going on in there, in the interregnum where, hedge funds are in there, and they're just giving consulting advice, of course, and there's nothing going on, I'm sure, with like, oh, we'll take an equity stake in that. Those folks, and then you've got your think tanks where everybody thinks there's great thoughts and these international relations theories. And then, you got the salons in Georgetown where everybody goes and thinks very seriously. And then I read about Sam Aronson, who's the one who has to execute our foreign policy on the ground with extremely poor guidance, if at all. But you know what? The power of that Sam Aronson, well, there are two things that really bother me about Sam Aronson. One is we sent him out there with extremely limited guidance, but then I get hopeful because he's America. He's out there making decisions. He understands what's supposed to be done. But number two is when he decides that he has to leave government because there's not a place for him to serve, because his bosses so let him down and we're not willing to modify their original assignment structure for him. And that breaks my heart because we're having a brain drain of our greatest talent. Like, that guy should be, a senior leader at the State Department someday. And he's like, there's no future for me here, and he left. And it broke my heart when I saw that. But I just got back from Greece, went to Athens, business, never been there. Heart, went up to the Acropolis and all, where democracy was founded. And I'm trying not to be bitter anymore. I'm trying to be very stoic. But this book is a Greek tragedy. You have these figures that came in with such, they were kissed by the gods, the best and the brightest, the smartest people in the world, and had this great theory, and then think our president was the most experienced foreign policy president we'd ever had, and then they got mugged by history. And so I'm trying to be a little more, measured in my thoughts on this. But you said it here, man, this book is so good. You talked about fecklessness. You taught they were powerful people, but feckless when it came to the on-the-ground decision-making at Hamid Karzai International Airport in Afghanistan. And I think, when we're done with this, feckless, And I think about Ukraine, I think we have to be very honest. That was a cynical approach up front, where I sensed there was the idea that, oh, we don't want to start World War III, but really it was we want to give them just enough to keep them in the game. And so I'm a little troubled by, I'm glad you did this, I'm glad you set out the Biden doctrine, it was very important. I would offer in closing, Jake Sullivan has created this doctrine, and it's very powerful, and it's what we want to believe in. We, in the Trump administration, our first national security strategy was very, if you read it, was very internationalist, and you read the people that did that, the generals and the people that wrote that, and they're very proud of it. It doesn't matter if the president doesn't abide by it, if it's not what he believes. So I'm a little bit torn by the Biden doctrine. I think it's a Jake Sullivan doctrine, maybe. And I don't know how much really the president abides by that. So I'm not angry anymore. Yeah, I'm still a little bit angry. We surrendered in Afghanistan. Pure and simple. The wound that still exists in this, for many of us, about that is beyond comprehension, and we try to laugh, like laugh or you're going to cry, but for you to enunciate so eloquently that is a really important. I think it's more, maybe second version of history. You said that in the end. It's really important to get that straight. I wish someone would write the rest of the story. You highlighted a couple things. General McKenzie was the 4-star general in charge of Central Command, in charge of our pulling out of Afghanistan. He went to Doha as we saw that this thing was coming undone. And you highlighted in here for the first time, seriously, that he had negotiations. And my understanding was the Taliban said, we did not expect to win this fast. Holy cow. We do not have the combat power or the capability to control Kabul right now. Will you do it? And McKinsey looked at the logistics and all this and said, oh, we're not going to do that. If that's true, if that story is true, we need to pick this apart. And our Congress has not done a good job on their assessment. I know there's a big review. There's a commission that's doing this. But your United States military, you pay $1 trillion a year on your military. We have the thing called the 82nd Airborne Division to go tactical on you. A lot of people, some of you have served there in that organization. That organization's designed for one thing, and that's for crisis response. And it could be anywhere in the world in 24 hours. The fact that if McKinsey did in fact have that offer and did not accept it and put in the 82nd Airborne Division to lock down Kabul, I cannot tell you how disappointed I am. I'm glad you highlighted it. I'm glad there's some other things in there. It's going to be very helpful as we go forward on this, because ultimately we have got to come to terms with Afghanistan. And you started that conversation, so I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
That's great. We've covered a lot. I'm actually quite happy with this as a spectator and a moderator. I want to throw a couple of provocations out there for Alex and for the rest of the group. Maybe staying with Chris in Greece for a moment here. There's a weird. I'm kind of realist restrainer, so I have to think this. But there really is some hubris in this book. If I thought that I and my friends constituted the A team of U.S. foreign policy, I wouldn't tell him that I thought that, but they told you that they called themselves the A team. They also told you, I think more than once, the phrase "save the world" came up, and you mentioned it in your opening remarks. Again, if I thought that I was going to save the world, I wouldn't tell a journalist that my policies were going to save the world. But they did. And so I'm a little astonished, maybe not that they believe that they fancied themselves the A team, or that they thought that their policies were going to save the world, but that they had, if you will, the hubris to tell a journalist who wrote about it in Politico and in his book. And so there is a hubris that's happening here. And the contradistinction with the Trump administration, right, the gross, knuckle-dragging Neanderthal reactionaries, blah, 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 blah. Again, I can understand holding that view in my head, but I can't understand talking to you about it. So, and I think you saw, like, there's a weird also to bring up the Jake Sullivan foreign affairs controversy. So Jake Sullivan famously or infamously, I guess, wrote this article right before the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel saying the Middle East has been quieter than it's been in decades. And then they, insanely to my mind, furiously removed that phrase and rewrote it, thinking that the people who were going to receive the hard copy of Foreign Affairs in their mailbox might not notice the distinction between the hard copy and the electronic copy. But that's like, it's also a form of hubris, right? Both in terms of thinking that you were going to get away with that and of they have a tendency to say, and this comes through in the book, they want to de-emphasize the Middle East. Like everybody wants to de-emphasize the Middle East. Nobody wants to run the Middle East. But the way that Sullivan, in his thinking, got around that was to say, it's quieter than it's been in decades, so we don't have to emphasize the Middle East. Whereas it could be true that it's not quieter in decades, but you should still de-emphasize the Middle East because you don't have the tools that you need to fix it. So I want to push this idea of hubris in the Biden administration, number one. Number two, something that's come up in the lead-in to the election and also pertaining to something that Chris said is this issue of the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? And it's no secret, I think, that the Biden people felt understandably like their popularity took a huge hit. I mean, if you just look at approval of the president and you hit the Afghanistan withdrawal, it drops like a rock in August of 2021 and never comes back. And it's certainly true that there was hysteria in the media, and I might have been the only person on TV saying this was a dog's breakfast in terms of execution, but we needed to get out, and everybody knows we needed to get out. But they feel, or maybe you, I'm asking you to say, my understanding is that they really feel like that stung them and they've never recovered from it, and it has some implications beyond Afghanistan for foreign policy. So interpretation of the Afghanistan withdrawal, and then a third provocation to mount up on my trusty steed hobby horse here. They're at pains again to show that they tried diplomacy with Russia in the lead up to the Ukraine invasion. But something that comes out in your book and has come out elsewhere is that every single time they talked to the Russians, literally every single time, the Russians said, we're freaked out about NATO, we're freaked out about the US relationship with Ukraine, we don't like this. And it's become clear, Derek Chollet announced that the subject of Ukraine's external orientation and its relationship to NATO was never broached with the Russians in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine. So is that, I mean, to me, that's a real puzzle that you would not deal with this thing that is at the top of the list, and I think it's characterized in the book as being at the top of the list perennially in those discussions. If, as the administration says, there was no likelihood of Ukraine joining NATO in the policy-relevant future, and if, as the administration admits, it came up in every single discussion with the Russians, including in the days and hours leading up to the war, what's their account of why you wouldn't discuss that with the Russians, whatever else one thinks about Russia's various motivations? So hubris, Afghanistan withdrawal, political implications, and Ukraine diplomacy, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot.
Me first?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
It's your book.
Yeah, fair enough. On hubris, I mean, look, as a reporter, I always feel like I'm a very unqualified therapist. You know, everyone always kind of talks to me. Usually they talk to me about their problems. No one really talks to me about, hey, things are going really great. Usually they talk, oh, you know, this guy did this thing and I don't like that, or they don't listen to me enough, or whatever. So it's normal for people to complain to me. In fact, I've never had a day where people aren't complaining to me. I think that's just virtue of the beat, but also just the virtue of my profession. Look, I mean, I totally get how you could see it as hubris, and I'm not going to deny that it is. What I would say is I think it does really come from an earnest place. Like they were really freaked out by the Trump years. Like I cannot tell you. I mean, in the 4 years, Jake Sullivan and others create this organization called National Security Action, and the whole point of it was Trump is so dangerous, he's so terrible, and what he's doing for America is so bad that we need to create an organization to develop an infrastructure and a set of new thinking for whoever becomes the Democratic nominee to eventually combat him in the rhetorical space on foreign policy. And they take in the Bernie Sanders arguments and the Elizabeth Warren arguments and the Castro arguments, but mostly it's Biden folks. And then Jake Sullivan goes to work for the Biden campaign, and where do all those documents go? They go there. So in a sense, there was this feeling that like they literally had binders full of great ideas and the best ideas, and from the best and the brightest of the Democratic foreign policy space, and that they could present it. And so in a sense, they like, yes, the situation was so dire, and here they are, and now they've got the best ideas, and they're going to implement it. So you can call it hubris. I won't decline it, but you can also see it as like a general sense of confidence of like, we did our homework. Yeah. So we came in, and it has to be said that whether or not you sort of agree, who's in the top echelon of the Democratic foreign policy charts, it's these people. Yeah. You might not like what they stand for, what they say, but they are, like, all the names that we all heard of during the campaign transition of who was likely to be in those spots, they all got those spots. Right. So in a sense, it was like, Biden got his first draft pick for everybody. Afghanistan, no question. The polling showed that the Biden team got hurt for that, and many would say rightfully so. I think outside of what happened, one of the meta narratives, right? If you're calling yourself the A team, what you're saying is America's back. America's back on the world stage, and we're doing it, right? If the Trump was so chaotic, here we are, and what does it do? It sort of explodes your whole argument of competence, of having a steady hand at the wheel. What I would say, and that's sort of the thing I forgot to mention, is if you're the Biden team, you expected chaos in Afghanistan, you didn't expect it to be that chaotic. And so even that switch for them shows, hey, maybe they don't have it all figured out. And of course, the nation doesn't like to see America look bad on the world stage. And there's no question, even if you agree with the strategic decision to leave, as the Biden administration still does. And one of the news items that was pulled out of the book in Axios was that, Biden still thinks it was the right call. No one offered to resign. He didn't ask anyone's resignation. Like, he still thinks it was the right decision overall. So look, eventually, sometime down the line, historians, whenever the third or fourth or fifth draft of history is written, they'll all come to agree. Diplomacy with Russia. It was, in a way, it was offered. Like, they were willing to have the conversation with the Russians about NATO and the relationship with Ukraine. They were putting documents that were leaked in the Spanish press, of all places. The interesting thing is that the Biden team was like, look, no one is negotiating in good faith. And we know that on the Russian side. And we know that because they've given us Lavrov, and Lavrov the foreign minister, doesn't really have that much influence. And so if we're like literally talking to the Russians about the thing they say they care about the most, and they're still not actually negotiating in good faith, then they don't really care about the issue. That's sort of how they saw it. But they did offer him multiple diplomatic off-ramps. So as much as the Russians would say, we care about this, and maybe they do. Maybe they do. I don't like horror movies, so that's why I don't go into Putin's head. But it's possible that, that even if the Russians do care about it, the fact that they weren't negotiating, that maybe the invasion of Ukraine was more important than those other things. You had to focus on that first.
Emma, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of points. Back to the hubris. I feel like something that really comes through in the book is, the Biden team really seems to have this dichotomy between like power and powerlessness. And on the power side, it's almost like they adopted the Trump mantra of only I can fix it, right? The only we can fix it. We need to restore the world. We need to fix America's alliances, all of that stuff. And it's not as much about the person of Biden in that case. It's more about restoring what they see as America's mission in the world, America's image, stuff like that. So there's this sense of immense power that America can do so much around the world. And then on the other side, there's kind of this powerlessness internally. The narrative leading up to the invasion of Ukraine is very deterministic. It's almost like it's on rails. They know that this invasion is coming. They do not believe there is anything they can really do to prevent it. They talk about sanctions. They set up all these plans for what will happen after the invasion on sanctions, but they doubt that sanctions will deter Russia from invading. As Justin says, and as sort of come out, they never made any serious negotiating overtures to the Russians. There were suggestions around the edge that maybe they could, but a lot of what comes through in the book and the conversations is sort of, we made our position very clear to the Russians that this would not stand and they would suffer consequences, and that's sort of the approach. And I think a lot of this ties back to just what I was trying to say at the start, which is they feel themselves very much to be constrained by common wisdom, past practice, existing US policy in a way that I think has actually been quite detrimental to their ability to achieve their objectives over the long term. And that's something that I see, a bit in the Afghanistan case, but particularly in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, where they just couldn't think outside the box on whether there were other ways to prevent this.
Wow. I think, I have a throwaway line that everything you need to know about foreign policy you learn on the junior high playground. And you know how to deal with a bully. It's all there. I desperately am committed to an era of perpetual peace, but unfortunately, to steal from Kagan, the jungle's growing back, and we're in this real inflection point in our international relations. And I think what this group doesn't realize, I don't know how many of them been punched in the face before. I think that might be part of the problem, but the utility of force, and I hate to say this, I wish we were in a place where we didn't have to talk about this anymore. I wish we were in a place where we could talk about, the environment and green energy. I really do. That's where we want to get. What's that cliche thing about, who was it? It was Jefferson or somebody about, we'll be soldiers so our children can be lawyers and doctors so their kids can be poets. I don't know if that's true or apocryphal or not, but it's, that's where I wish we were. But what I really am, like right now, this is a jungle, and it requires utility of force, stealing from our British compatriot. And what I'm seeing right now is an aversion to underpinning our statements with force. And I'll give an example. Doggone, we lost 3 American soldiers to a drone attack, Iranian-sponsored drone attack, a month and a half ago. That was the first time American soldiers, American fighting forces have been killed by an enemy air attack overseas since April 17th, 1953, during the Korean War. This is a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare. What did we see the administration do? Signaled our punch, basically apologized that we were going to have to kill some Iranian-sponsored proxies. I wish we didn't have to kill people. Seriously. I've done it. I'm like, we got to move beyond this. But there's something missing, and I'll tell you what, we got challenged in Afghanistan and we failed. What's happening in Taiwan now? I read something probably in Politico the other day. There have been 2,400 incursions of the airspace zone. They got that, so they've got that, but Straits of Taiwan, they got that line, there's a line right there. And if you cross that thing, you're in Taiwan airspace. And right now, I had this great question during that balloon silliness. That was great timing for my book, by the way. Thanks for helping me out. You got to have a hook, and everybody's the Chinese fly that balloon, and they're like, what's Miller going to talk about for his book rollout? We know nobody cares about this stuff. And then I had the balloon, and it was the gift that just kept giving, right? You're like, they flew another balloon. Oh my gosh, I've got another week to sell my book. But what you learn about that is, the 2,400 incursions of the airspace, we've got Iran is absolutely running us around in circles. And so I can't help but think there's a disconnect right now between the willingness to use force to underpin our objectives. And I don't know why that is, and I defer to you because you know these people and you've studied it and really looked at it.
I think they feel, and I always don't want to get into to where I'm talking for them. I'm not talking for them. I'm doing this as a reporter. My understanding about them is they feel that it is actually better in this age where information is everywhere and signaling does matter and context matters and rhetoric matters, that it is better to say what we're actually trying to do to ensure that there's no miscalculation. That it is better to, and also to avoid escalation. In a place where you don't necessarily want to get into World War III, you don't want things to get out of hand, where you want to manage expectations, it is better to say, here's what we're going to do, here's what it means, there's a line, don't cross it. Now, you could argue that lines have been crossed multiple times, to each their own. But that's sort of how they see it, and especially if it's the Middle East, the last thing they want to do is to effectively be dragged back. Yeah. And so it is better to let the Iranians know, if they do something like that, attack them, let them know what it means, literally tell them what it means, and then hopefully that sort of settles things down. But that is aspect of, there's always strategic ambiguity. It's better to maybe to have a bit of a madman or unpredictability in your foreign policy. This team cares very deeply about predictability. They would see that as a strength more than a weakness.
And I think there's an almost Hamlet-like indecision there too, particularly with the troops in Syria and Iraq, and the Iraq thing may be coming to a head sooner rather than later, which would bring the Syria thing down with it. But this is an area where personnel are policy, and I think it's no secret that the people who are driving the bus on the National Security Council, have a view of the Middle East that is very forward-leaning, that is very traditional in terms of its affinities and alignments. And so, my response to the Syria attack, the Tower 22 attack, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, is to say, is the game worth the candle here? What are these troops in Syria supposed to be doing? And the harder you push those arguments, the more you see, well, they're kind of sort of supposed to be bait. And then you say to yourself, well, what is the point here? They're keeping Israeli strikes into Syria safe. They're doing a variety of different things, but from an America first, let's say, point of view, is leaving these people vulnerable day in and day out a game worth the candle? So that's, I think, one, where they're not going to come to a decision forcefully one way or the other on that, and so they're left kind of counterpunching to say, oh, well, they hit us, we're going to hit them back, and people like me throw our hands up and say, what the hell are we even doing in Syria? I want to, before we throw things open to the audience and the online people who can ask questions on the website where you're watching or in social media using the hashtag CatoFP, I want to do something terrifying. You said you don't like horror movies, so you don't try to get into Putin's head. I don't like scary things, so I don't try to imagine myself a 20-something very often. But I think in the context of generational debates and disputes in political parties about foreign policy, there's a real one going on in the Republican Party right now, where the energy of people in Congress, people talked about in the Trump administration who are, say, under 60 or under 55, and you juxtapose them with a Mitt Romney, Mitch McConnell view of foreign policy, there's a real disconnect there. And I think there is kind of a disconnect, too, in the Democratic Party that may be different in certain ways. But it's particularly come to a head with the Israel war in Gaza, where you're seeing a lot of young people say, what are we supporting, right? Asking themselves questions about that. So in an uncharacteristically polemically phrased question, the book sort of sets up Biden's foreign policy as both new, the foreign policy for a middle class, but a kind of restoration at the same time. Is Biden's foreign policy a boomer foreign policy, or is it some new sort of foreign policy that's spearheaded by Gen Xers like Jake Sullivan?
I mean, it's both. And I think that's what leads to a bit of policy muddle, right? Or at least messaging muddle. I mean, the Ukraine defense initially was not only defended as, but truly the reasoning was, there's a democracy that was attacked, we've got to defend it, world order's at stake. Now, part of the Israel defense after Hamas's attack is, well, one, Biden, we've all heard the gold in my ear story 80,000 times. He cares very deeply about Israel, but it is also it is a democracy that's under attack, we got to defend it. Now, they don't really make that argument so much. Yeah. It's very much like we got to be strong against terrorists and whatever. But at the same time, this is the same administration that said we're going to put human rights at the center of our foreign policy, that we are going to care very deeply about that. And look, I was in Jeddah in July for the Mohammed bin Salman fist bump. I saw it live. Also, don't go to Jeddah in July. It's hot as hell. But I was there, and the whole time, we went to Israel first, right, which was a sort of a pro forma stop. Sure. Biden says Israel's great. I'm feeling my bones, whatever. And then they're like, great, now we're going to the real main event, which is this trip to Saudi Arabia. And the whole time we're asking, we sort of get the general strategic argument, right? If you've got this idea for Abraham Accords and you're worried about the Chinese having more influence in the Middle East, fine, got it. But this is totally anathema, not only to the campaign promise of making Saudi Arabia a pariah, but also your human rights thing. And they would go, yeah, but the way you actually put human rights at the center of your foreign policy is you go and to talk to these people and you have these tough conversations and you tell them that you care about it.
Sure.
So all this to say is that is their argument. It doesn't really work for let's say the younger generation. But what I think you're seeing is you have Biden, who is the avatar for traditional American foreign policy, being somewhat dragged along by those who mostly agree with it, but want a bit of a shift, and that's why you're seeing a bit of a tug of war and a bit of muddle, but it's nowhere near where a certain wing, especially the Democratic Party, wants them to go. It's not far enough, so it's still mostly a boomer with a sprinkling of Gen X.
As I want to say when I watch foreign policy hypocrisy, shamelessness is a superpower that I do not possess. Because, reconciling the fist bump with these democracy tinglies is not something I was able to do. Emma, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this gets to something important, right? All of the debates that we're having about foreign policy right now are an attempt to come to terms with what has happened in the last 2 decades and the absolute Charlie Foxtrot that has been US foreign policy during that period. And different groups, generations, political parties are reacting in somewhat different ways to that. And I think what we're seeing in the Biden administration is, they are trying to incorporate some of those insights. They're saying we don't do nation building anymore. We don't want to get sucked into another war in the Middle East, so we won't strike the Iranians particularly hard. But what they're not willing to give up on is the sort of very expansive rhetoric around America as the indispensable nation. That's the boomer idea that's animating a lot of this, right? They're not willing to give up on that, and that is where you get this dichotomy that Chris mentions between, we don't back our statements with force. To some extent, the Biden team is aware that there's not public support for this use of force, but they can't stop themselves making the statements regardless. And, to me, that's the big problem at the heart of the Biden foreign policy.
That's great. I'm going to throw it open because I'm still sort of making my way through this tablet here for the online questions. We'll go to the MeetSpace audience first. Let me ask you, number one, wait for me to call on you. These Klieg lights are really bright. Number two, please wait for the microphone to come to you. And number three, please ask your question in the form of a question that has a question mark at the end of it.
There's so many rules here at Cato.
We have more.
I thought we were
despite
libertarian.
the
Holy
libertarian
cow.
situation, yeah. And identify yourself if you can. Audience question right there.
We're waiting for the microphone.
It's coming in hot.
Hi,
There it is.
Hi, thanks. My name's Steve. I'm a great fan of Mr. Ward's and Politico's reporting. Could you give us a review of the exchange between our president and President Zelensky as the Russians were coming? Also, with all due respect to Politico, the New York Times has an awesome and very sobering piece this week on nuclear war. Could you give us some insight into the concerns that the administration might have about exchanges, tactical nuclear strike in Ukraine, and the implications in some of the states that might be looking to develop or enhance their own programs beyond that? And thank you again.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the kind words, and no offense taken about the New York Times. They'll get to Politico stature at some point. They're great people. I should have honestly talked about this at the start, and I'm glad Emma brought it up. The Biden-Zelensky relationship leading up to the invasion was awful. The screaming match bad. The reason being, Zelensky really much, as the U.S. saying, hey, we have this intelligence, we're telling our allies about it, here's what we know, right? We're seeing the blood bags, we're seeing the field hospitals. Also, you don't put hundreds of thousands of troops on a border as an exercise. And yet Zelensky was saying, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe it to be true. And the reason is his own intelligence apparatus didn't have it, which we could debate about why that may be, but his own intelligence apparatus didn't have it. He also didn't think Putin would be stupid enough to invade Ukraine. And he was genuinely worried. His poll numbers were very low at the time, we should note. And he was very worried about, hey, if your guys are saying this invasion is going to come, then our economy is going to take a hit because no one's going to want to invest here, and then I'm going to look even worse. And Biden is basically saying, dude, defend your country. The Russians are coming. And to the last minute, he would keep saying, no, no, no. And Biden is literally on the phone looking to his staff going, what do I do? I don't know what to say. I don't know how to convince this man. He wasn't alone, by the way, Zelensky. The administration sent officials over to Europe many times to say, here's the intelligence we have. The Brits were like, yep, got it. We see it too. You're right. The French and the Germans weren't feeling it. They weren't sure that it was right. In the French military intel chief got fired over basically saying, no, there's no way, the Americans are wrong. The Russians aren't coming. So there was a strong look. The Americans called it. The Biden administration called it right. They had the right intel. They made the case, but certain allies weren't for it. And of course, Zelensky, until the tanks rolled in, did not believe it was going to happen. Now, nothing sharpens the mind like having your country getting invaded. So literally the moment, like Zelensky sees what's happening, he goes, okay, where are my weapons? Where are the sanctions? What's happening? And then they become friendlier, not friendly, but friendlier. And to this day, the Biden-Zelensky relationship hasn't fully recovered. It's better because they have more alignment on what they're doing, but it's, of course, ruptured, one from that pre-invasion period, but also because Zelensky wants more than the U.S. is willing to give. But yeah, it was truly, the thing that I expected most people to pull out of the book in terms of news coverage was not necessarily Biden on Afghanistan. It was, hey, maybe that Biden-Zelensky relationship wasn't so good and still hasn't been so good since the start.
It's uncommon that we get questions centered around a certain theme. The Afghanistan thing is blowing up the tablet, but there's something.
Cato?
Yeah, there's something we haven't talked about, which, it wasn't a focus of the book, but you have some insight into it, and you mentioned the sort of rising affinity for protectionism or antipathy for free trade, or both. So Thomas Grennis, Kent Jones from Babson College, and somebody who I think is anonymous down here, ask about trade, right? So is there any prospect for return to a rules-based trade regime under Biden's second term or Trump term? WTO, trade dispute settlement, a bunch of wonky stuff. Free trade, and that is sort of true, right? We have, you talked about the similarities with Biden and Trump, steel tariffs, a whole number of things. The IRA did not make a lot of friends overseas for trade-related reasons. So the politics of more liberal trade versus protectionism, looking into the future and where maybe the Biden people see fences and yards and things of this nature.
Sure. By the way, I realize I forgot to answer your nuclear question. Very quickly, and I'm happy to do it more afterwards because it's my fault for forgetting, but simply put, in terms of the Ukraine invasion bit, they were, as part of the Tiger team, they were looking into the possibilities of a nuclear attack, and they were sort of like 50-50, it could happen. So what does it look like if it happens? What does it look like if it doesn't? They were talking to allies about this possibility, and one of the things that they learned was a lot of allies, and Biden was very worried about this. So when it came to escalation, it was like there were people who were saying, well, we can probably do a bit more than we think, than we're allowing for now, because the Russians aren't going to do anything beyond this. They're expending all of their energy. And then there were others who were saying, yeah, but they have nukes though. So that was sort of a limiting factor, but let's talk about it more afterward. And I'm sorry for not answering it fully before. Trade. You're more of a trade expert than I am, so I'd prefer to pass to you. But I will say, generally speaking, look, the collapse of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it scrambled politics, not only in DC, but for across parties. And there was a sense here that free trade ain't going to happen. It's not a thing we're going to do. And in fact, part of the China response is they have been beating us and taking our IP and defeating us commercially in national security important technologies, and so maybe we need to be a bit more protectionist in those spaces and restrictionist in making sure that they don't get some of those things. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. I happened to be in Davos, pause for booze, but I happened to be in Davos during, right after the IRA was passed. And my editorial mission that I had for my editor was just follow Joe Manchin around, see what happens. And sure enough, I'm there, and Macron is yelling at him, and a bunch of industry is yelling at him, and he's in his folksy way, he's just kind of no, we're doing what we need to do to defend our industry, and also he was rightfully saying, you Europeans are mad we're being protectionist. Right. That's rich. And look, he's Manchin's handing me his phone and being look at these texts I'm getting. He was really happy to be the pugilist there. Yeah. But there was a real sense, and it was sort of interesting, the fact that he was there defending a protectionist trade play or an industrial play was fascinating. And it showed that the politics had really changed, and that the Europeans, as much as the Biden administration likes to work with allies, didn't mind pissing them off on this, because they thought that this was an important thing to be better in green tech and all that. So anyway, sort of an interesting little moment. And of course, for him to do that at Davos was for story writing.
Emma, do you want to get in on the low politics here, or?
Sure. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but let me just make, I guess, so a couple of points about Biden on sort of the economic statecraft stuff. I mean, one is that the administration has moved quite clearly from, sanctions. They understand the limitations of sanctions. They understand they can be powerful, but they don't usually change policy. So they've absorbed all the criticisms of sanctions. And what they have done is move to a new tool. Well, several new tools: export controls, trade restrictions, things like that. They are looking for ways to use American economic centrality and power to inhibit, Chinese economic growth and various other things. And it's the same logic underlying it all, right? It's using American economic strength to make it difficult for other countries, particularly China. My main concern, apologies to Chris here, but, is that they're making the exact same mistake the Obama folks did, which is they're setting up a variety of very powerful tools, laying them out, and then leaving them for a potential next Trump administration. That's what happened last time around, and I sense that may be what happens this time if the election goes that way. And then the final point, I guess, is on trade. At least in theory, the Biden team say that they are not purely protectionist. They say that they have a vision of fair trade, right? Much of it drawn from sort of Elizabeth Warren on the campaign trail. That positive vision just hasn't panned out in practice. Other countries aren't willing to buy it. It's just not taking hold, and they're really struggling to even make it sound coherent. So, what they're left with is that coercive bit of the trade policy, and in that they just look fairly similar to the Trump administration. Do you want to get in?
I'm not a trade.
You want to do international trade, Chris?
Actually, one quick thing.
I'd love to try it. Wow. But I think this is a serious audience.
One quick thing. I talked to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo last week, and it was about they put forward new export controls on China, and I started asking about TikTok because I'm cool and hip, she said something which struck me. It was she had sort of said this before, but she went beyond. She goes, "Look, if Congress were to give me," by that she meant the Bureau of Industry and Security,
right.
Authorities, I'm willing to ban any company that's like owned by China in the U.S. And I went, huh. And I wrote about that instead of what they actually wanted to talk about. But and then lo and behold, what came out yesterday? The Gallagher, Krishnamurthy, hey, let's separate ByteDance. Right. So it sounded like Congress was listening, and this is a bipartisan consensus here. But the Biden administration is that's the signal that they're sending, that they're open, not that they would, but that they're at least open to that. Yeah.
Let me bring in my colleague John Mueller is doing John Mueller things by asking questions that are really hard to answer. So I'm going to put this to you and maybe to Chris too. It is put succinctly. Why was everyone so wrong about how long the Kabul government would be able to hold out? ?
I asked this question, thank you, John. I asked this question approximately 800,000 times as part of the reporting for this. And I literally went to everyone and I said, look, as part of the book, I also write, look, there was so much open source stuff out there in the New York Times, a fine publication that we made fun of earlier. Saying that, look, the Taliban was preparing for this. Again, they were surprised at how well it went, but they were preparing for this sweep, and they expected to do pretty well. Why did no one really question the 18 to 24 month timeline? And I'll be honest, I failed as a reporter. I did not get a good answer. I got 1,000 different answers, but no one really answered it. From Intel folks to DoD folks to White House folks to state folks. No one really answered the question. So I have an unfortunate answer, which is I don't know. I wish I did. I would have written it. Yeah. But I don't know. And it just seems, so this is a guess. My guess is, even though they did a very thorough, comprehensive internal review, which was like, they all did like the Manchurian candidate thing. Every time I talked to them, they all stood up like, we did an inclusive, robust, comprehensive review. They all basically, we all knew what the president wanted. We all knew he wanted out. We all knew that he said on the campaign, basically we had to prove to him that we needed to stay and that there wouldn't be this Afghanistan takeover. And by the way, I should note, Mark Milley, General Mark Milley, who was the Joint Chiefs Chair until recently, in a February 2021 meeting, he goes, if we leave, the Taliban will eventually take over and women will be sent back to the Stone Age and all of the small d democratic progress we made will have been lost. Yeah. And that was a general sentiment within the Pentagon. So it's not like no one there was saying the Taliban won't eventually come to power. Right. But you're right, on the timeline, the speed of it, I just don't know. Well, the one sort of answer I guess we have is Bill Burns, the CIA director, saying, well, maybe we just don't have good enough an intelligence capability to understand the will of the fighter.
Sure.
And now that's what they're working toward. But even then, we all generally knew from what's in the open source that the training hadn't gone so well, that there was a bunch of abandonment, and that they didn't really have a government worth fighting for.
I mean, it wasn't a bad Taliban assessment. It was a bad ANSF assessment. You know, I mean, it wasn't an enemy assessment. It was a friend's assessment.
Yeah, but
Chris, do you have thoughts on Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's very simple. Anybody that spent 90 days embedded with the Afghan National Security Forces or the government knew what was going to happen as soon as we pulled out our support. And it really came down when, so I literally thought, oh, I see how we're going to do this. We're going to draw this down. We're going to leave stay-behind force for counterterrorism. We're going to maintain our contractor capacity to continue to service their aircraft, logistics, pay, administration. Then you hear, wait a second, when the president said everybody's out, and we pulled that contractor support. Anybody that had spent any time in Afghanistan said, war's over, this is going to be a matter of weeks. So the issue is, the perpetual problem of American foreign policy and national security is a lack of cultural awareness, and also I will absolutely blame the blob in Washington, D.C. that includes the intelligence community. That's the other takeaway from this book, is how many more times can the intelligence community get it wrong before we do something about it? So I said I wasn't going to get angry, but I kind of did there. Sorry about that. So that's where I just take great offense to this idea that no one knew this was going to happen, because you didn't listen. This administration did not listen to the people that were in the field that knew exactly what this was. This was completely predictable what happened in Afghanistan. So I think there's a very clear reason, and I just said it. So there.
Anybody else here in the audience? There's a gentleman right down here in the front row on that side.
Thanks. Excuse me. I'm Ken Myercourt. I got here late, so I apologize if this has already been covered, but how do you interpret the resignation of Victoria, fuck the AU, Newland?
Simple. She didn't get the Deputy Secretary of State job. She wanted it. She was very open about it. Well, internally, she was very open about it. Granted, first she was passed over. Initially, it was supposed to be John Feiner. I broke the story. They wanted John Feiner. The president, via Jake Sullivan, asked him to stay, and then they choose Kurt Campbell. So at that point, she's like, I got no future here. I'm out.
Okay, then why did they choose Campbell over Newland?
Partly because China's the big thing. Kurt Campbell is Kurt Campbell. I'll just let it sit there. And I think there was, to a certain extent, maybe a worry about, hey, if we put her. Well, look, I think we could put it more generally. I don't know the exact reason, but I just know that she's been passed over at least twice. But I will say this: as part of the reporting for this, in my general reporting, there's no question that within the Biden administration, it is the State Department that is more forward-leaning in wanting to arm the Ukrainians. They are, as one person put it to me, generally, the State Department is Ukraine's element in the administration. And that comes from
the top.
That comes from the top. The Blinken and Newland and others. And it's the Pentagon that said, well, hold on a second. Yeah, we might send these weapons, but we have to make sure we have enough. We got to worry about future fights, et cetera, et cetera. So there was always been this sort of DoD state tension that the NSC has had to broker. But I think that there's a sense now that we're not as forward-leaning as state would like to be, so maybe don't have one of the leading proponents of that forward-leaning posture as the number two. But it is, I also think, just a function of there was trust in John Feiner. The president eventually told him to stay, and then Kurt Campbell is Kurt Campbell.
I wonder how much of Mr. China Campbell's time is being taken up with Benjamin Netanyahu in the Middle East and all the. I mean, there was this great conceit among the China hawk community. Finally, we have somebody, and lamenting his departure from the White House and heralding his arrival at the State Department. I thought to myself, the org chart doesn't dedicate that position to focus on. I mean, it's a very global position, as it were. There's somebody right there on the aisle. It's all on this side. You people have to up your game on that. All right, you're coming next.
My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. When I saw the subtitled The Fight to Restore American Foreign Policy After Trump. It doesn't matter who. You don't want to go back to your American policy, which people like me experience. I'm 81 years old. So you have all the assumptions that Americans make about being the world leader, saving the world. You gotta forget about it. It's over, you understand? And I don't want to tell you, I came to this country in 1967, bought by the CIA to prevent me from going to the Soviet bloc. And when I agreed to come, I didn't tell them I came up to blow up America, because I was a revolutionary, anti-imperialist, et cetera, et cetera. But I met a lovely lady who I fell in love with. She saved America.
Okay. So is it worth, Emma, do you want to jump in on that?
I was just going to say, can I ask you a question, actually? Because I'm hearing mention of Africa, and Justin's talking about Middle East, and with the Kurt Campbell decision. I mean, it's really, really obvious in this book that just China didn't get the attention that the administration thought it would when it came into office. And I'm just curious, the book obviously ends some time ago at this point. From your perspective, how those dynamics are still playing out. Are the China folks inside the administration still making a play to try and, seize more time, more policy attention, or are the transatlanticists and the Middle East folks still managing to sort of gobble up all the attention?
I will admit that I admit that I didn't mention China probably as much as I should have at the end of the book. But one reason I didn't.
That's the second book, though. That's the way I read it.
You got to leave them a little bit more, right?
Yeah.
Although I will say a friend of mine, I won't say who, but said if Trump wins that the sequel should be called Nevermind. But I think it's kind of funny. Anyway, part of the reason is actually just narratively it wasn't as interesting because the China competition is everything and therefore nothing.
Yeah.
And so it almost felt like
Consensus.
I
right.
would sort of have to weave it through. And in fact, one of the early readers of the book, I believe it was you, were like, this needs to, if you're going to mention China, like either make it a chapter or just kind of find a smarter way to weave it through. And I was like, I'm not that smart. I can't weave it through. So I mentioned it where I could, but I didn't really focus on it because generally speaking, we all know that the competition is sort of forever and always and about everything. Yep. So it was just narratively, it just didn't work. But that's part of the reason. So I think if you talk to the team, I mean, again, everything is about China. The IRA, not the Irish group, the Inflation Reduction Act is about China. Ukraine is about China.
Yeah.
The export controls, obviously, about China. The focus on climate change, about China.
Normalization in the Middle East is about China.
It's about China. Like why I was in Jeddah in July was about China, ostensibly. So like it's just everything, and again, nothing is about China. So it's why I didn't get as much attention in the book. But I think so even if they are being pulled in the Ukraine direction and the Israel-Hamas direction and the normalization direction, the whatever direction, they would still go, but there's a China angle. There's always a China angle.
And you mentioned, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the Middle East the China justification for the emphasis on Saudi-Israel normalization, even at the expense of U.S. security guarantees to both of the principles in that dyad, carried the day, right? My understanding is that we're competing with China in the Middle East. If we don't get to run the Middle East, China will do it, and that'll be terrible for reasons that I can't get into. Is that
they were open about it.
Yeah.
I mean, John Kirby said it. He said it there. He wasn't at the podium yet, but I believe Brett McGurk probably said. I mean, there were stories about how it took months for Sullivan and Brett McGurk, the Middle East chief in the NSC, to convince Biden to make this trip, to go back on the Pariah promise, and part of it was this China competition. And they said it constantly when they were there in the Jeddah hotel for press, which was shockingly not the best hotel in the world.
Right.
But they always put, fun little fact, they always put, press who follow, everyone thinks it's a very glamorous beat. It can be, but one, Air Force One is not a great plane. And two, for us, and two, they don't always put us in the good hotel where the fun people are. That's a little inside baseball. But anyway, all this to say, is that, it's just like that was a big China thing, and that's why we did the fist bump, right? And the simpler answer for why, yes, China may be a part of it, and the Chinese and the Saudis were making some entreaties, but it was also gas prices were high, and even though we make our own energy, there was questions about OPEC, et cetera. And so isn't it foreign policy for the middle class to have lower gas prices?
Sure. Worked like a charm. Yeah, I have to commend, there's a paper outside by my colleague John Hoffman called Pariah or Partner, which does great violence to the administration's argument on Saudi-Israel normalization. The lady down here in the front was up next and still is up next.
Hello, thank you so much. All of you have presented some issues that might be negative in the Biden's administration towards the foreign policy. And since the foreign policy is always very hard to manage because, it involves independent actors, not everything is, under strict control of any president, I guess. So how do you, in general, foresee the results of Biden's administration towards the foreign policy? Is there a risk of, chapter 2 of your book, like restoring the policy after Biden, or do you think it's going to be positive? Thank you.
Maybe I have to do a theme, the fight to restore American foreign policy.
I bet
Previous president.
I bet we have different grading curves, but Alex, you should go first.
About grading Biden? I mean, look, I will say I finished writing this book about it roughly this time last year. And the last major scene I write about was Biden going to Warsaw right after his trip to Ukraine. And look, it felt like a campaign rally for NATO. Like there were flags everywhere. They were playing Twisted Sister really loudly. They had taken over this castle, in Warsaw. And all that was missing was the mission accomplished banner, really. Like it was just this sense of like, we did it, baby, woo-hoo. And Biden's there going like, he stands strong, stands proud, stands free, nailed it. And the counteroffensive doesn't work a few months later. And now we're here. So I think, part of the reason the book sort of ends with a more optimistic tone, and actually it really ends with Jake Sullivan saying like, we've changed everything, we nailed it, at a speech at Brookings of all places. I think at sort of the time of writing, including Afghanistan and everything, I think you give him a B-, maybe trending towards B. This past year, I think that grade gets worse. But that sort of the time capsule of the book, you could argue, I think in terms of what they set out to do, and I think the defense of Ukraine up to that point gives them a lot. But I should also note, again, they came in saying, and you can still find it on the White House website, by the way, climate change, the #1 national security threat, existential crisis. Yeah, we have a movie on fossil fuels and the IRA, great, but do they talk about it? Has it been solved? Has it gotten much better? And then this is my own personal thing. My favorite subject to cover as a one-on-one is North Korea. My favorite thing is I talk to them, and this does actually give you some insight into how they think about alliances. I wrote a story and I said, well, this strategy ain't working, is it? And they go, well, of course it is. Yeah. And I go, well, North Korea's program has gotten more dangerous and they're threatening, et cetera. And they go, yeah, but we've now gotten closer with the Japanese and the South Koreans. We've had this meeting. And look, whenever the North Koreans do something, we'll have an allied coordinated response. But then, to which I said, but do they have more dangerous weapons or more nukes now or not? And they go, that's not the metric.
Confusing means and ends, right? The alliances become the ends.
Yeah, so by their own metric, it's an A, of course. By my metric, I'd say B-, maybe B. I think after this last year, I haven't done it. That's the second book, but the grade would be lower. I'm
just happy that you didn't have an Ivy League grading curve. Emma, what do you say? Grade the Biden administration's foreign policy, thumbs up or thumbs down?
At this point, it's definitely a gentleman's C, at least. I think as Alex says, they get a lot of credit for crisis response, particularly in the Ukraine context. They did a very good job of the coordination of diplomacy and pooling together allies. But I think, again, this is sort of the broader problem with their foreign policy, as Alex says here. It very much focuses on the process. It focuses on, can we build greater unity with partners? Our deliverables are joint statements, or they're, agreements like AUKUS or something like that. And that doesn't necessarily move the ball on achieving concrete policy outcomes. And this is something that I see, for example, in the way the administration is currently handling Ukraine funding and the future of where that's going. There's a lot of focus on, they're trying to ensure that Europe remains united, that everyone's on the same page about Ukraine, that Germany doesn't start to go wobbly. But the problem is at home, right? That they don't have a good strategy, and Congress is not going to give them more money unless they come up with something better. Maybe not then, but at least they need something better. And so they're sort of, they're really missing the forest for the trees, in my view.
Chris, either you or I is going to have to do the Price is Right thing and do $1. Go underneath. Yeah, right. What do you say? Biden administration's foreign policy.
Old school, really believe that the hyper-partisanization of foreign policy and national security is a threat to America. And I'm old school and believe that politics should stop at the water's edge. Outcomes matter. My takeaway from your great book was a lot of attention paid to narratives and communication strategies. So we have to go with outcomes. So here's where I am on outcomes right now. We surrendered in Afghanistan. We have Chinese provocation absolutely at a scale we have not ever seen before. We've got North Korea launching ballistic missiles at will with no meaningful response. We saw the AUKUS debacle. We have 117,000 Americans being killed, dying every year due to illicit narcotics flows across our borders. I could go on and on. So what I'm hoping for is a little more substance, a little more outcome-driven as opposed to public relations narratives. I get tired about this narrative that we're great in Ukraine. We failed to deter the Russians. We used our most precious assets, our intelligence information that was collected by exquisite means with this very, and you saw in foreign, is it foreign policy? What's the one you always buy and you say you're going to read it,
Foreign
and then it stacks up, and it stacks up, and then like 6 years later, you've got like the stack up to here, and you're like, I meant to read that article. It's fun to go back, and where there was this great article about this is how we used intelligence and a diplomatic means to deter, but it didn't work. So I want to see like outcome driven and not so much a lot of squawking and talk and back to hubris. You started with hubris, and I think that's really critical.
And I just want to very briefly say that analysis, very cogently put, I heard a lot. As part of, I didn't obviously just talk to Biden folks. I talked to people on the outside, and I would say more often than not, it trended in that direction than in mine. I was sort of, as I think Emma rightly outed me, I'm sort of grading on crisis response. But in terms of the holistic nature of it, I heard mostly those two analyses.
Material reality, not messages and rhetoric. It's a very good read. I was reminded that I read it in galleys, and I was trying to match up the galley page to the actual manuscript page to get my comments in order. The Internationalists, The Fight to Restore American Foreign Policy After Trump, by Alex Ward. They're available for sale outside, if I didn't mention that already. And we have sandwiches and whatnot upstairs for lunch, but please join me in thanking Alex for being here and writing the book and our discussants. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, man.
Good work.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks, bud. Appreciate it. No, thanks for doing this. Thanks for doing it.